Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Imagine for a moment you see a clear path forward. A solution, maybe, backed by tons of evidence. Something that could really improve things for millions of people.
Yeah.
Now imagine there's this huge wall, sometimes you can't even quite see it, standing right in the way.
It's a good way to put it.
That's pretty much the landscape we're exploring today. We're diving into part 2 of this really insightful investigative report. It's from the Unlocking Phonics Project and AI analysis team, led by Humphrey.
Right.
And this section has a pretty provocative title, The Bureaucratic Wall, How Educational Bureaucracies Systematically Block Reading Reform. That's asking a big question.
A crucial one.
Why, when we have decades of clear science on how kids learn to read, is fundamental change just so incredibly hard?
It seems like it should be simple, right?
Exactly. So we're going to unpack the layers of resistance that seem to stand between the research and, well, actual impact in classrooms.
That's absolutely right. And our mission today, it isn't just to summarize. We want to dig deeper, really extract the core insights, some surprising ones actually, from these detailed case studies. They looked at different states.
Okay.
We'll try to lay out the systematic patterns of this bureaucratic resistance that the report identifies. And maybe most importantly, think about what this means for educational change more broadly. For you, listening, trying to understand these complex systems.
Okay, let's get into it. Because you might think, well, once the science points to the best way to teach reading, and by science reading, we're talking about that whole body of research, cognitive science, linguistics, neuroscience.
About how the brain actually learns to read, phonics, phonemic awareness.
Right, vocabulary, fluency, all that. You'd think, okay, now we know, let's just do it.
Should be straightforward.
But this report, it just meticulously shows it's anything but. We're going to see how these deeply entrenched systems can make even, well, what look like obvious steps incredibly difficult.
It's fascinating. Institutional inertia, maybe, but also sometimes feels like outright obstruction, according to the report.
So as we start peeling back these layers, the report gives us specific examples, really brings this bureaucratic wall to life. These aren't just one-offs, are they?
No, definitely not. They argue it's a pattern. Detailed case studies of bureaucratic obstruction.
Okay, first up, Michigan. The report presents this as a prime example of just sustained opposition over multiple legislative cycles.
Yeah, years and years.
And think about the stakes. Michigan ranked 43rd nationally in 4th grade reading. That's bad.
It's alarming.
And in 2024, just 39.6% of 3rd graders were proficient. I mean, despite these numbers screaming for change.
Reforms were blocked, stalled for years.
It's more than a delay, isn't it? It feels like squandering potential.
That's a good way to put it. And what really jumped out at me from the Michigan section was this quote.
Oh, yeah.
From Senator Jeff Irwin, a Democrat from Ann Arbor. He was championing the science of reading legislation. And he just laid bare the bureaucratic strategy. He said, "It seems to me there are some rather obvious steps we haven't taken yet. I'm hoping we can move forward with those obvious steps by weaving the science of reading into our curriculum."
Wow. Obvious steps.
Right. And the report's point is that the very fact these obvious steps took years.
Yeah.
Well, they argue that demonstrates deliberate strategic obstruction.
So it wasn't just things moving slowly, it was active blocking.
That's the report's finding, yeah.
So given the evidence, given the need, who exactly was building this wall in Michigan? And why fight so hard against it?
Well, the report points to what it calls a bureaucratic opposition coalition.
Okay, who's in it?
Primarily, local district superintendents, administrators, also teacher education programs. And let's be honest, they would face a huge task, right? Overhauling their whole curriculum.
Sure, that's a big lift.
And then state education department officials who, it seems, much preferred offering guidance rather than, clear mandates. Control seemed to be the priority.
And what was their strategy, according to the report?
The strategy, as the report lays it out, cleverly focused on funding concerns and implementation timelines.
Ah, the practicalities.
Exactly. But the report calls these classic delay tactics. They protect the existing system, but they sound reasonable on the surface.
Right, like, oh, we'd love to, but we just don't have the money right now, or it'll take years to roll out properly.
Precisely. It's like saying, yeah, we agree we need to get there, but, the road's too expensive, too long to build right now. Maybe later.
Okay, so why protect those systems so fiercely? This is where the report gets, well, uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It points to pretty significant financial implications. This isn't just about policy disagreements. It's about money.
Indeed. The report argues that the resistance protected massive revenue streams in Michigan. Millions annually.
From what?
From things like ineffective curriculum contracts, so paying for materials that weren't actually working well. Also, professional development programs for balanced literacy. Now, balanced literacy, just for context, often mixes phonics with other strategies, like guessing from pictures or sentence structure.
The 3Qing system, yeah.
Right, which the science shows can actually hold many kids back. But these PD programs, they generated income.
Okay, well.
Then there's revenue from remedial intervention services needed because kids weren't taught effectively in the first place.
So the failure creates a market.
That's the implication. And even, disturbingly, special education placements for artificially created disabilities. The report suggests some reading difficulties were labeled as disabilities when they might have stemmed from poor initial instruction.
That's a really crucial point. The system sometimes resists change because it financially benefits from the problems it's supposed to solve.
It's a powerful feedback loop. Failure, ironically, generating revenue.
Okay, so Michigan showed us outright obstruction, but Texas offers a different flavor of resistance, maybe more subtle.
Yeah, the report calls it a pseudo-implementation strategy, the illusion of compliance.
How so? Because Texas actually passed House Bill 3, right?
Right.
Which explicitly required systematic direct instruction in phonics. Sounds as a win for science of reading.
On paper, yes. Yet the report flags findings from the National Council on Teacher Quality. They found that 39% of Texas teacher prep programs were still teaching methods that contradicted the research.
Still, even after the law.
Mm-hmm. And they also reported widespread non-compliance with the actual science of reading requirements in schools. And the continued use of discredited methods, just often sneakily rebranded.
Branded how?
Given different names, basically. So it looks new, but it's the same old ineffective approach. It wasn't just a mistake. The report frames it as a calculated workaround.
That sounds exactly like bureaucratic doublespeak, which is a term the report uses.
Mm.
What did that look like on the ground in Texas?
Well, it's the art of sounding supportive while actually undermining things. So the report says Texas bureaucrats would claim support for evidence-based instruction, right? But then define evidence-based so broadly it could mean almost anything.
Watering it down.
Exactly. They allowed flexibility, which basically opened the door for schools to keep using the old failed methods. They focused heavily on compliance ticking boxes.
Rather than effectiveness, did the kids actually learn to read better?
That seems secondary. And they pushed gradual implementation, which, often just means delay.
Right. It's like being told to build a bridge, but then saying you have flexibility on using cement or sand.
Or that gradual implementation means maybe pouring the first foundation next century.
The process becomes the goal, not the outcome.
Precisely.
Okay, now Florida. This one's really interesting because the report calls it a rare exception. Strong political leadership actually managed to break through the bureaucratic resistance there.
Yeah, initially it looks like a success story.
So you'd think, okay, game over, bureaucracy lost, right?
Well, not quite, according to the report. What's fascinating is the bureaucratic response wasn't surrender. It was a strategic shift in tactics.
Wow. Adaptable.
Very. It shows how committed they are to maintaining control even when they face real pressure.
So if they couldn't block it directly anymore, what was the new strategy? How did they keep the wall standing, even with a hole punched in it?
The report points to a few clever maneuvers. First, they shifted focus to implementation compliance rather than effectiveness.
Again, with the compliance.
Yep. Making sure teachers filled out the right forms, dotted the I's, but not necessarily checking if the teaching was actually working better.
Okay, what else?
Second, they created what the report terms book challenge bureaucracy. Now, book challenges are a separate issue, obviously.
A very hot button one.
Right. But the report suggests this served as a massive diversion, pulling attention, resources, energy away from the core task of improving reading instruction.
Plausible. A distraction.
Third, they imposed a heavy administrative burden. Just piles of paperwork, new rules, procedures. It overwhelmed teachers and districts, made genuine reform harder to actually do.
Death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Kind of. And finally, they engaged in selective interpretation of requirements. finding loopholes, reading the law broadly to keep that flexibility.
Which often means an escape route from real change.
Exactly, an avenue for noncompliance, essentially.
And there's that quote in the report from a Kansas policy analyst that just cuts right through it all, doesn't it? About the system versus how kids learn.
Oh yeah, that one's powerful, the analyst said. Don't expect bureaucracy to allow science of reading approach to make a difference. The science of reading is based on the development of the brain, not an artificially imposed grade-level system that is based in a child's age.
That really nails it, and it highlights this fundamental mismatch.
It does. Science of reading follows how kids' brains develop language. But the system is often built around administrative convenience, age-based grades, standardized tests.
Not the organic individual learning journey.
Right. The bureaucracy, the report implies, prioritizes its own structure over biological reality.
Okay, let's move to Wisconsin. Here, the report shows resistance operating through political allies. Specifically, the governor's office, the executive branch.
Yeah, even when the legislature passed science of reading requirements, Governor Tony Evers vetoed the bill.
And the report characterizes that veto as basically protecting the bureaucracy.
Protecting the bureaucratic status quo is the phrase used. Acting as a firewall against the legislative push for change shows how different parts of government can become part of that wall.
So how did the opposition justify that? How did they frame vetoing something with so much evidence behind it?
Well, the Wisconsin Education Association Council, WEAC, the teachers union, led the charge.
Yep.
Their statement said, Governor Tony Evers has signed into law a bill that triples the amount of testing for young learners and outlaws certain teaching methods.
Outlaws teaching methods.
Yeah.
That sounds bad.
It's powerful rhetoric, isn't it? The report points out this framing turns evidence-based requirements into something that sounds like outlawing professional judgment.
Implying it's taking away teachers' autonomy.
Exactly. Reframing a scientific mandate as an attack on professionalism, that's a much harder argument to counter in public debate.
But it seems like the resistance just keeps finding new ways. Even after Wisconsin did finally pass a law, Act 20, the report says the fight wasn't over.
Not at all.
How did the bureaucracy continue to undermine it, even with a law finally on the books?
The report details several more subtle but still effective channels of resistance. One was a significant lack of state funding for implementation.
The classic unfunded mandate problem.
Right. It cripples any new initiative. They also provided only minimal professional development support, so teachers didn't get the training they needed to actually change their practice effectively.
Makes sense.
There was also continued opposition from education associations, keeping the pressure on locally. And finally, selective compliance by districts.
Meaning some just ignored it or did the bare minimum?
Pretty much. Just chose to ignore or only partially follow the new requirements. It's depicted as this ongoing morphing battle. Resistance just adapts.
Okay, final case study. North Carolina. This one illustrates maybe the most, insidious tactic. How bureaucracies can actually influence the legislation itself.
Yeah, weakening the requirements before they even become law.
Like rigging the game from the start.
That's a way to think about it. The report states the original Science of Reading bill was significantly modified through bureaucratic lobbying. This wasn't just fighting a law, it was getting inside the lawmaking process to shape it, to make it less potent.
So what did that look like? What kinds of compromises got baked into the final law in North Carolina?
The report highlights several key bureaucratic-friendly provisions, strategic compromises. For example, the bill ended up saying it was grounded in the science of reading.
Instead of based on it.
Right. It sounds similar, but grounded in is looser. It allows for more wiggle room, a broader interpretation. Based on implies much stricter adherence.
Like the difference between a house inspired by blueprints versus one built exactly to the blueprints.
Good analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Second, it offered professional development options rather than requirements, making training voluntary. That's a huge loophole.
Yeah, if it's optional, the people who need it most might not get it.
Exactly. It also included, again, that implementation flexibility that enables non-compliance, the broad definitions we saw before.
Okay.
And finally, grandfathering provisions that protect existing contracts. This meant even ineffective curricula or PD programs already in place could just keep going for years. No clean break.
So it created this veneer of reform.
Right, an appearance of progress.
While keeping the underlying system mostly intact.
That's the report's conclusion. A masterclass in seeming to change while resisting fundamental shifts.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of how these systems work? I mean, it paints a really clear picture, doesn't it? How incredibly complex and, well, sometimes undeniably deliberate the resistance to change can be.
Yeah.
Even when the data, the science, the needs of kids, it's all screamingly clear.
It's not just inertia or apathy. The report argues it's an active, often sophisticated defense of the status quo. Outro.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive into the bureaucratic wall. It really lays bare the systemic challenges in education reform, doesn't it?
It really does.
We've seen these pervasive, adaptable patterns.
Yeah.
Outright delay, pretending to comply, shifting tactics, even capturing the legislative process itself. It's a pretty sobering reminder that change isn't just about having good intentions or solid research. It's also about navigating these powerful, entrenched systems.
Systems that often have their own survival mechanisms built in.
Yeah.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, these case studies taken together really illustrate how educational bureaucracies, for lots of reasons.
Financial interests.
Financial interests, absolutely. Huge institutional inertia, a preference for control, for guidance instead of clear mandates, maybe even philosophical differences about learning.
Right.
They can systematically block reforms, even when the human cost, kids not learning to read effectively, is just devastatingly high.
It's not necessarily a conspiracy, is it? It's more like
Right.
a system functioning as designed to protect itself.
That's a fair interpretation of the report's perspective, yeah.
This journey through the report's second part, it's been really eye-opening, shows the sheer ingenuity of resistance when established systems get challenged.
It does make you wonder.
Makes you wonder how many other obvious steps in other critical areas are being stalled in similar ways.
So what's the takeaway? The patterns we've talked about today suggest that just identifying a problem or even passing a law, it's often not enough. Not enough to guarantee real change in these complex systems.
Oh.
It seems to take a much deeper understanding of the rules of the game inside these bureaucracies.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of this formidable bureaucratic wall. Thank you so much for joining us for this essential exploration.
And maybe something for you to mull over. If this bureaucratic resistance can be so systematic, so adaptable, and sometimes so financially entrenched, what kind of truly novel strategies might actually be needed to push through critical reforms like the science of reading? And who, at the end of the day, really bears the responsibility for making sure every single child learns to read effectively?